Consistent Premillennial Preterism, a Quantum Shift. Episode 4. This Generation. The key text is Matthew chapter 24, verses 33 to 34. Welcome to my audio series. In this episode, we're going to consider what Jesus meant by the phrase, "This generation shall not pass away," as spoken by him in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, verse 34. This verse alone has caused untold problems throughout church history, and in modern times, even the renowned Christian thinker and apologist C.S. Lewis called this the most embarrassing verse in the Bible, concluding, somewhat shockingly in my opinion, that Jesus was in error concerning this statement about his return within that generation. As much as I respect and admire the work of C.S. Lewis, I have to strongly disagree with him on this point, as I do not accept the notion that Jesus, along with the apostolic writers of the New Testament, were in error concerning these things. I strongly believe that it has been the Church's misunderstanding of these things since the late 1st century that has been in error. I've heard it said a number of times in various documentaries about Jesus and the Apostles that they expected the return of Christ and the end of the world in their lifetime. But because this didn't occur as they expected, then they must have been mistaken about it all. Well, as should be fairly obvious by now, I don't agree with these conclusions. Anyhow, moving on, here are the words of Jesus as recorded in Matthew chapter 24, verses 33 to 34, and I'm reading from the New International Version. By the way, this text can also be found in Mark chapter 13, verse 30, and Luke chapter 21, verse 32. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Now, firstly, it is important to note that all three synoptic gospel writers record the same thing in the Olivet Discourse. Jesus begins by saying literally, Amen, which was another way of saying, truly, I'm about to tell you an important truth. He said this to emphasize the importance and truthfulness of what he was about to say. He then uses a double negative, by no means or definitely not, to emphasize strongly that this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things that he had been talking about had occurred. He was emphasizing how soon these things were actually going to take place. To make it mean something else in the distant future empties it of its true import. Many times throughout his ministry to Israel, Jesus spoke about this wicked and adulterous generation. And this phrase always referred to those who were alive at that time in the 1st century. A generation was usually understood to be anywhere between 20 and 40 years, 40 being the upper limit due to the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness for ancient Israel, by the end of which time that Exodus generation had died, having failed to enter the promised land. For example, see Numbers chapter 14, verses 29 to 35. The number 40 also symbolizes probation or testing, which is very significant. All this is made quite clear in Psalm 95, verses 10 and 11. For 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. All of these themes are being tied together in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 to 11, where the writer, quoting from Psalm 95, was preparing and encouraging the Jewish Christians of that 1st century generation to enter the Sabbath rest of Christ's coming kingdom. This New Testament letter would have been written well before 70 AD, probably during the early to mid-60s. throughout the letter to the Hebrews, those first century Jewish Christians were being warned about falling back into the temple worship of Judaism, because its days were numbered and the fiery judgment of God was about to fall upon Jerusalem and the temple, exactly as Jesus prophesied in his Olivet Discourse. See Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 to 39, and also chapter 12, verses 25 to 29. In fact, Jesus had already pronounced judgment upon that generation during his final week of ministry. It was this generation who were about to reject the true Messiah and his apostles. This divine indictment spoken by Jesus in the temple courts is recorded in Matthew chapter 23, just before the Olivet Discourse in chapter 24. That is to say, these chapters should be viewed as a continuous narrative and understood within the same context. Here is Matthew chapter 23, verses 35 and 36. And this is Jesus speaking. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. I tell you the truth, all this will come upon this generation. Now, Jesus was clearly stating here that judgment was going to fall upon the generation of Jews that he was talking to. That is, his contemporaries. For he said, upon you, upon this generation. And the judgment did fall upon that generation within 40 years in the events of the Roman-Jewish War of 66 to 70 AD. Now, permit me to get a little technical here, for we need to consider the translation of the Greek word genia. Some Bible versions put race in as a footnote for generation in these texts, indicating that the Greek word genia can mean race as well. Well, this is rather misleading, and one of the apparent reasons for this interpretive footnote is that the translators are clearly following the popular futurist interpretation that is often the view of dispensationalists. Even the New Bible Commentary, in its notes on Matthew 24, says the following. Quote, the NIV margin offers race as an alternative to generation. This suggestion is prompted more by embarrassment on the part of those who think verse 30 refers to the parousia rather than by any natural sense of the word genia. End of quote. That quote's from the New Bible Commentary, 21st Century Edition, on page 937. Although I agree with what is said here about the natural sense of genia being that of generation, nevertheless there appears to be a little confusion over the use of parousia. The writer clearly believes that the Greek word parousia, meaning presence, refers to the second advent in this discourse. And that correctly, in my opinion, although a little earlier in the commentary text, it is admitted that this word need not always refer to the second coming. Now, to help you, the listener, make some sense of this, here is what verse 30 of Matthew 24 says, that was referred to in the commentary quote. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth, or tribes of the land, will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, from the commentary comment quoted earlier, it is evident that the writer believes that because the word parousia isn't mentioned in this verse, it then follows that if one thinks that this verse does refer to the second advent, then one is clearly mistaken. And it then becomes an embarrassment because, according to this view, the parousia didn't happen in this generation in the first century. Nevertheless, a few verses earlier, in verse 27, the word parousia is used of this coming of Christ, which, in the context, is clearly referring to the same coming of the Son of Man of verse 30 that was to occur in this generation. You know, this is circular reasoning, that will have you going round and round in circles. In fact, this is a good example of the kind of inconsistency that arises when commentators interpret the Second Advent in accordance with popular misconceptions of it, while seeking to be consistent with the Olivet Discourse itself. The ensuing result is that, even by partial preterist standards, the Olivet Discourse gets contextually broken up, leading to a compartmentalizing of A, the coming of Christ to this generation, followed by B, the alleged yet future coming of Christ of the Second Advent. That is to say, there are two alleged comings of Christ in the Olivet Discourse, a view that I'm convinced is completely in error. There is only one second appearing of Christ, one parousia, which is equivalent to the coming of the Son of Man. All of these mentioned in the Olivet Discourse, and this event has already taken place in the first century. I must emphasize the point here, though, that a past second appearing in no way denies a future consummation event. And this is in fact what Revelation chapter 20 verses 1 to 10 is clearly portraying. But I must leave that for another time in a later episode. Anyhow, nowhere in Matthew's Gospel does the phrase "this generation" mean anything else but the generation then living. Jesus did not say "that generation," referring to a future generation, but he said "this generation." Yet according to the futurist view, in the context of Matthew 24, verse 34 quoted earlier, this generation is referring to the final generation of unbelieving Israel, who will see all these things unfold, that is, the various signs and events of Christ's return, and they will not completely pass away until all these things have occurred, which includes the visible return of Christ himself. Only then will the wicked generation pass away and be no more. Well, this view only makes sense if the whole discourse is removed from its original context and then superimposed onto a foreign interpretive grid such as premillennial dispensationalism. If this were true, then Jesus' emphatic statement about this generation not passing away would become a little redundant. If he meant to say that the race of Israel would not pass away until all these things occurred at the end of the age, which is now already over 2,000 years into the future, then not only was this irrelevant for the disciples of the first century, whom he was talking to, but it could also imply that the race of Israel will pass away in the end, when the events are complete. Yet, according to dispensationalists, Israel will continue on forever. Now, this is a big contradiction. No, I do not accept this as being good exegesis. The only viable interpretation of this generation, as stated earlier, in accordance with sound exegesis, would be that this refers to the generation of Jews living at that time in the first century, from 30 to 70 AD, who would experience all these things coming upon Judah and Jerusalem via the Jewish-Roman war of that period, and the subsequent day of the Lord. That is, the parousia, or royal presence of Christ. That generation would eventually pass away, but not until all the events that Jesus had spoken of had occurred as foretold. Excuse me. The Greek word genia, translated as generation, is widely recognized in most concordances as denoting the generation of people living at that time. If Jesus had meant to say generations in the plural, or race even, then the Gospel writers, under inspiration of the Spirit, would have recorded it that way, but they didn't. Jesus clearly meant that judgment was going to arrive on the generation living at that time in the first century, and all these things were going to occur before this generation had passed away. Here is what Wayne Jackson said in his Study of Matthew 24 article, available on the website christiancourier.com. And I need to add that Mr. Jackson holds to the traditional partial preterist view. Quote, Genea is found 43 times in the New Testament. In 17 of these cases, the expression is this generation. In Matthew's record, for example, this generation is found in chapter 11, verse 16, chapter 12, verses 41, 42, and 45, and chapter 23, verse 36, and also chapter 24, verse 34. A careful consideration of these passages provides a clear sense of the significance of the expression. For instance, Jesus, surveying the Jewish wickedness of his day, warned of an impending punishment. He said, "All these things, the consequences of the Jews' rebellion, shall come upon this generation." That's from Matthew 23:36. Why is it millennialists contend that this generation, in chapter 23, verse 36, is the generation devastated by the Romans in AD 70, but allege that this generation, in chapter 24, verse 34, refers to a faraway future day? Arndt and Gingrich suggest that Genea denotes, quote, basically the sum total of those born at the same time, expanded to include all those living at a given time, a generation, contemporaries. McClintock and Strong state that the phrase "this generation" in Matthew 24:34 denotes the generation of persons then living contemporary with Christ. That's end quote. I totally agree with this explanation. Therefore, as shown earlier, Jesus was clearly stating that judgment was going to fall on the generation of Jews that he was speaking to, that is, his contemporaries, and it did within 40 years. Here is a reminder of the important text of Matthew chapter 23, verses 35 to 39, where Jesus said the following, "And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come on this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you, how often I've longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." What Jesus was really saying here, in this heartbreaking indictment against the Jews of his day, was that this generation would receive the ultimate generational curse of the law of Moses, connecting them with all of their murderous forefathers of previous generations. Their ultimate sin would be murdering the Messiah, the Son of God. Even at that time, Jesus pronounced a curse upon the temple, telling Jerusalem that your house is left to you desolate. Hence, as subsequently stated in his Olivet Discourse, all these things will be arriving on this generation, because they had not recognized the time of God's coming to them in the form of Jesus as the Messiah. This is made evident in the following text from Luke chapter 19, verses 41 to 44. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." When Jesus had approached Jerusalem a week earlier, during his triumphal entry, he'd uttered these fateful words, which were fulfilled almost 40 years later, when the Roman armies under Titus surrounded the city of Jerusalem in 70 AD and laid siege to it for 5 months. They eventually built a wall of wooden stakes around the whole city, using all the trees in the vicinity for miles around, cutting it off completely to starve the inhabitants. Thousands of Jews were slaughtered in the process, and the whole city and the temple complex was totally destroyed, and not one stone was left on another, particularly in the sanctuary area. All these things came upon this generation just as Jesus had forewarned. He had come to cast fire on the land, and now the time had arrived to cast this fire of God's wrath and vengeance upon the city and its environs. This is what Jesus was referring to in the following quote from Luke chapter 12, verses 49 and 50. I have come to bring fire on the earth, or land, and how I wish it were already kindled. But I have a baptism to undergo, and what constraint I am under until it is completed. This was a clear reference to Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 22, where the fire of God's wrath would fall upon Israel to destroy the land. An event so cataclysmic that it is metaphorically described in the Olivet Discourse as being like heaven and earth passing away. These divine judgments are also being portrayed in hyperbolic and apocalyptic type language in other similar passages. Here is the verse in question from Deuteronomy chapter 32. For a fire will be kindled by my wrath, one that burns down to the realm of the dead below. It will devour the earth and its harvests, and set afire the foundations of the mountains. This particular judgment of fiery wrath upon Israel was to cause a huge upheaval in both heaven and earth, causing foundational shifts in the cosmic order, an event that would even affect the realm of the dead, which in the Hebrew is Sheol, equivalent to the Greek Hades. That is to say, this fiery display of God's wrath, indignation and justice would involve the judgment of the dead via resurrection, something that the New Testament always associates with the second advent of Christ and the full establishing of his heavenly kingdom. It is no coincidence that portions of this prophetic Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 were cited or alluded to by the New Testament writers, particularly in Paul's letter to the Romans and the letter to the Hebrews. They were showing that these things were being viewed as events that were being fulfilled in the 1st century AD. To conclude this episode, let me emphasize the following. All of the events prophesied in Christ's Olivet Discourse were said to occur before this generation had passed away. There just isn't any honest way of getting around this statement. Therefore, in the same way as all the earthly events took place by 70 AD, so did the heavenly spiritual events occur also, including the great theophany of Christ's return and the coming of the Son of Man in power and glory to establish a new created order in heaven and earth. In the next episode, we shall consider the key text of Luke chapter 21 verse 22, along with verse 24b, where Jesus stated that the 1st century desolation of Jerusalem would be, quote, the days of vengeance to fulfill all that has been written. An era that would complete the times of the Gentiles. For further information, please visit my website at www.purposeoflife.org.uk.